Hi, welcome to the Eureka Centre Ballarat. My name's Fred Carr. I work at Federation University. I'd like to commence this episode of Talking History by having an acknowledgement to country. I'd like to acknowledge that we are living and working on Wadawurrung country and pay my respects to elders past and present. I'd like to thank Eureka Centre for inviting me onto this terrific program of Talking History. And it's a July edition of Talking History. If you're new to this series, it's a series of public lectures run by the Eureka Centre, Ballarat, to share Ballarat's history and share our research into our very rich history here in Ballarat. Tonight I'm going to be talking about a book that I've been researching for the past close on 30 years. The title of the book is My Country All Gone, The White Men Have Stolen It. The subtitle is The Invasion of Wadawurrung Country. And it covers a chronological period of 1800 to 1870. And in this presentation I'm going to be showing you images, talking to the images in effect, as so you get hopefully a really sound impression of what the book covers. It's written by, I'm a non-Indigenous person. I have Irish forebears that came to the Ballarat region during the gold rush period, so I have sort of that background, if you like, that genealogical background in our local history here in Ballarat. This is the front cover of the book that shows a Wadawurrung woman as depicted by a non-Indigenous artist in the 1850s, dressed in her possum skin cloak, and we'll talk about the attire of Wadawurrung people during the gold rush period a bit later on in the presentation. Just a moment, just getting familiar with the technology here. As we saw in the previous slide, this is about a history of Wadawurrung history in the Ballarat region, and the Wadawurrung country covers an area reaching down to the south, reaching as far as Geelong, in that Geelong region, and in the southwest as far as Winchelsea, bordered by the Fiery Creek area up to Beaufort in the northwest that is. And so we're bordered by the Djadjurrung people, the Boonwurrung people to the east, the Gulajan people to the west. So it's a very large area of country that we see being represented by the Wadawurrung language group. Here's a better picture which shows some of the major towns. You can also see there's a number of numerals in that linguistic map there that shows the number of clans. We know that there are approximately about 30 clans that formed the Wadawurrung nation, or the Wadawurrung speaking people. I'm going to be talking almost exclusively from a non-Indigenous perspective. I'm not speaking from a Wadawurrung person's point of view or Wadawurrung cultural point of view. I'm speaking from an invader's point of view, in fact, and I'm deliberately taken this view in this book and this presentation to, I wanted to have the invaders' voices rather than trying to represent Wadawurrung voices, which I was trying to avoid at all cost, in fact. And I wanted the invaders' voices because often we have not really heard from the actual what's called the primary sources, what the people in that contemporaneous period were thinking and what they wrote down and what they illustrated about the Wadawurrung. So this is a book not by Wadawurrung a culture. It's about the contact relations of the invaders and their interactions with the Wadawurrung as they commenced their colonisation, their invasion of Wadawurrung country. And we can see clearly from the records, both the pictorial records, as you can see here in this illustration of views on the south coast of Australia, includes what we would now call indented head in the second panel. The views of the Wadawurrung came from in that very early period. When I say early period, I'm talking 30 plus years before official invasion occurred, which was in 1835. So our first records of Wadawurrung people from the British perspective, and also the French perspective as well, which we'll mention and go further into in just a moment, was predominantly from the sea. So from the British naval point of view, which is who drew these illustrations. We know that Wadawurrung country, particularly the coastal clans of the Wadawurrung people, were encountering shipwrecks of Bass Strait, as we know, was or is still one of the most tempestuous sort of places, pieces of ocean in the world. And so there were many very early wrecks, and this is a French illustration, a very early French illustration showing an unspecified place in southern Australia, but representative, I suppose you could say, that we know that Wadawurrung people were encountering white goods, white technologies is the point I'm trying to make by using this illustration, that they were encountering their clothes, some aspects of their culture, how they travelled, what they looked like, how they behaved, and vice versa. We know through the newspapers of the time that the British and the French were gaining their own impressions of the Wadawurrung and other coastal clans along the southeast coast of Australia as well. So there was a great deal of interaction and a great deal of what we would now call intelligence gathering that was occurring in this early period of roughly between 1800 and 1835. Most people are relatively unaware that sealing and whaling were Australia's first major export industry. Long before wool became an important industry for Australia, whaling and sealing was our principal industry. And to give you some idea of the extent of this industry, how extensive it was, we know that tens of thousands of whales were harvested, killed in southeastern Australia, and hundreds of thousands of seals were shipped, were caught and shipped over to export countries over in Europe. We see the illustration on the left of sealers at Western Port Bay. You can see a Boonwurrung woman has been illustrated, in that highlighted in that orange rectangle. So we're fully aware through the sealers and whalers records and the government records as well that there was an extensive interaction, and usually this interaction was quite violent. There was a sexual servitude going on between the sealers who were enslaving Aboriginal women and children and kidnapping them and taking them to other whaling and sealing stations literally across the globe. A very sad period, a very violent period in interracial relationships. So this was the start of the Wadawurrung's contacts with the English and the French, the Namadij, and I'll explain what that term, a little bit more about that term. That's the term that Aboriginal people used in this part of Australia the Kulin people in this part of Australia used for to describe white people. Literally translated, it's thought to translate to a white spirit, and I'll talk more about that in just a moment. There was also a convict colony very early on in the piece, again almost over 30 years before official colonisation or invasion commenced. And we see in this very early illustration that violence was very much a characteristic of of all the colonisers' interactions with the Wadawurrung. Bar a few examples which we'll talk about in a moment. But in this example we see the British naval expedition, I should add, not a civil expedition but a naval expedition, as in military naval expedition, firing upon a very large party of Wadawurrung people, 300 warriors it was reported. When they got back to their ship, their main ship just off the coast of what we now call Indented Head, in that area at least, they then fired their naval ship's cannons at the retreating Wadawurrung on the beach. So it doesn't leave much to the imagination as to what the Wadawurrung thought of the British invasion. In this illustration we believe, is probably the first illustration of Wadawurrung people by the British colonists. This was a book published in 1805 by a military officer, Lieutenant Cahir, who was on an exploration expedition ordered by the governor of then New South Wales. I should add that what we now know as Victoria was a part of New South Wales until separation in 1850, over almost 5 decades after this illustration was published. We see this. It's a poor illustration, but it's a really interesting illustration in that it's the earliest illustration we can find of Wadawurrung people, and he goes into some detail in fact in that book titled Port Phillip in Bass's Strait, describing the gentleman that's illustrated there. I suspect that most of you will be aware of one of Australia's most, struggling for words, probably notorious is probably one word that springs to mind, illustrious is another word. I'm talking about William Buckley, a convict who was at the convict colony I mentioned before, that was in present-day Sorrento, that operated only for a very short time, and he and 11 or 12 other convicts escaped from this convict settlement, and Buckley is the only known survivor. He lived for 32 years with the Wadawurrung. The convict settlement packed up and went to what was then called Van Diemen's Land, Tasmania, and Buckley was rescued by the Wadawurrung, and his saviours, literally the Wadawurrung, kept him alive for over 3 decades. So Buckley learnt the language fluently, and we have some great deal of evidence, a great deal of knowledge about the Wadawurrung has sprung from people writing about Buckley. Unfortunately, he was illiterate, so he didn't actually write anything himself. We have this really interesting illustration on the left, which is actually an Aboriginal artist, a chap called Tommy McRae, who did this illustration, which depicts Buckley. And this was an illustration painted in the 19th century. So it's not a first-hand account, because the Aboriginal artist wasn't from this region at all, but he'd heard of Buckley's through the trade, sort of the network, the trade network that existed between Aboriginal groups in Victoria. You can see Buckley, the only white figure, dancing, and the title of the illustration by Tommy McRae, the Aboriginal artist, is When the Melbourne Tribes First Saw the White Ship, which is ably sort of illustrated. Buckley was a huge giant of a man, 6'6", and had previously been in the British Army. So again, the knowledge that was being passed by Buckley to his Wadawurrung family now, he was known as Murrungurk. They thought he was in effect a reincarnated Wadawurrung person. So they adopted him into their community as a family, literally as a family member. I said I'd mention more about Namadij. This is the appropriate spot because Buckley became the most famous Namadij probably in Australian history, in that his story, very briefly, was that he was on the verge of dying just near Indented Head, and from a lack of food and water, and he encountered a Wadawurrung grave, and the grave happened to be the grave of a person called Murrungurk, and Buckley's appearance near the grave and his the fact that Buckley picked up a memorial stick, a grave stick to Murrungurk, signified to the Wadawurrung that he was Murrungurk reincarnated in effect. I mentioned previously about the very large impact and very large exposure that Wadawurrung people had to the British from the sea. In 1820s, we also had Wadawurrung people encountering people such as Human Hovel's exploration party. You can see the map there, and outlined in blue the area where the Human Hovel's party travelled through Wadawurrung country. And Human Hovel actually describe in their journals that they, as they were leaving Wadawurrung country down near what's now called Lara, in just southwest of Melbourne, that they heard a cannon being fired from in the area of Corio Bay. So we know that there was an extensive number of whalers, sealers, castaways, escapees from convict settlements in Tasmania, explorers from both France and Britain, sealers and whalers from literally all across the globe, all having this rather furtive sort of encounters with the Wadawurrung. But they were all characterised in this period, and the period I'm talking about, again, just stressing, was between 1800 and 1830, was characterised by relatively brief, more often than not violent, but brief encounters with the Wadawurrung people and the Namadij, as they were known. The real invasion commenced in 1835 with what is very commonly known as Batman's Treaty. John Batman was an entrepreneur, and along with 17 others that are actually listed on that map, it's very hard to read, but they literally carved up a very large swag of a very large section, I should say, of what we now would call Port Phillip. And you can literally see in this map the cut, the numbers signify the squatters, as they were then called, who were going to occupy Wadawurrung and Wadawurrung and Boonwurrung country under the pretense of a treaty that they had established with Wadawurrung and Boonwurrung clan heads at the time. Very quickly, I want to just also direct your attention to that proclamation by the government at the time. Richard Burke was, that Burke Street is named after, who was the governor of New South Wales, trying to force the colonists to not occupy what we now call Victoria. But it all became hopeless, so the government kind of caved in to the squatters and what would soon become their hundreds of thousands of sheep and cattle that would be the almost, I would describe it as the spearhead of the British invasion, was the hundreds of thousands of sheep. More about that in just a moment. What the British colonisers, the squatters in particular, encountered was a very large groups of Wadawurrung people in very settled communities. So we have descriptions from the early colonists of what Bruce Pascoe and Bill Gamage have popularised in their very popular books about the villages and the use of fire as an agricultural tool and the farming of vegetables, of indigenous vegetables. This is an illustration on the left of the native women getting tambourine roots, probably the yam daisy. Often the colonists reported how prolific the yam daisies were. By way of example, one of the first colonists to travel through just at the tip, the northwest cusp of Wadawurrung country was a man called Major Mitchell that some of you may be familiar with. In 1836, I think his journey was through that area. He described the region as a sea of gold. The landscape was just gold as far as he could see. He was describing the flower head of the yam daisy, just to demonstrate to you how prolific this indigenous vegetable was. I'd liken it to the Irish potato in terms of it was a staple food of most of the people in all of Southeast Australia. There were also reports by people such as John Batman as he was travelling through Wadawurrung country along the Werribee River and the western reaches of what we now call the Maribyrnong River, of eel farming. He described weirs, dozens and dozens of well-built weirs made out of rock and timber that were 4 feet high, spanning these rivers and creeks everywhere he travelled in Wadawurrung country. So the point I'm trying to emphasise with this slide is that there was very much a settled aspect to Wadawurrung lifestyle. It was not a nomad existence whatsoever. That's very much not what was occurring in Wadawurrung country. What surprised me about one of the things that surprised me about this story was initially at least, the lack of violence that occurred. When I went to school, the only information I gained about our occupation, the British occupation of Australia, was the violence story. And certainly the violence was very endemic and very prevalent in Australia, and that includes on Wadawurrung country. But there were also these, I liken it to islands, very remote islands of friendship in an ocean of violence. And I was really struck by the number of illustrations, as you can see up on the screen here, and also in the text records as well, the squatters' records and the government records as well, of how much the Wadawurrung people had what I describe as agency. They were not passive recipients of violence and of the new economy and the new political structure that was being brought down upon them. They actually engaged in a very willing and able fashion, and I think probably the most apt expression we would use these days to describe these sorts of interactions is living two ways, that they were quite okay, it would seem, from a white historian's perspective at least, to embrace the new goods, the new exciting aspects of white culture, such as horses, guns, tobacco, sugar, the stimulants, and the language, the music. We have these, there are humorous moments in this very, essentially a violent story of invasion. One such story, if I can quickly take a detour, is of a white fellow walking through the bush, through the Wadawurrung bush, and hearing a Scottish song being sung in perfect Scottish sort of accent and lyric, and thinking that it was a group of Scottish shepherds, only to come round the corner over the hill to discover a group of Wadawurrung people singing a classic Scottish song. So my point is that they were embracing what they liked about white culture and dispelling what they didn't like about white culture. And there was a lot not to like, but they certainly were not adverse to embracing what they wanted from white culture. This is an illustration in 1847 here in almost central Ballarat, near Sebastopol, and it's Ewell Station. We have Ewell Primary School and Ewell Street, and one of the early squatters, one of the early British squatters to come into this area was William Ewell. What I'm trying to demonstrate by showing you this illustration is the interactions that, as one historian described it, as a living together, living apart story. There was a great deal of very close interactions that was occurring in the midst of this violent frontier. There was also a lot of very intimate and amicable relationships going on at exactly the same time. So it was very much a mixed environment that Wadawurrung people were encountering from one sheep station to the next. It would have been very bewildering at times, knowing that at some sheep stations, such as Ewell's sheep station, they were relatively welcome, and and often they worked, and they were having a corroboree by the looks of it in this particular scene. Many reports of that occurring. And yet at other sheep stations, as we'll see in a couple of slides' time, there was very much an atmosphere of brutal violence, that of a virtual war occurring. So very much a mixed environment that the Wadawurrung had to encounter. Here are a couple of more illustrations of that working together, sort of living apart sort of relationship that I was describing before. You can see these aren't necessarily pictures of Wadawurrung people. They're generic style colonial pictures. So this sort of events was occurring right across the colonial frontier of living inside, literally, the white huts at times in certain situations, working alongside them. The first, by way of example, the first police magistrate, Foster Fynes, described how on his tour of squatting properties in the Wadawurrung district, he encountered Wadawurrung stock workers on almost every single station he visited. Many of them he described as having very amicable relationships, such as seen in these illustrations from that colonial period itself. Of course, the violence was ever present, very much omnipresent. And again, going back to Foster Fynes that I just mentioned, the first police magistrate, his job was to investigate these sorts of events that you see in the illustrations of Aboriginal people preparing to attack the colonists, and in the illustration on the right, is titled by the artist The Avenging Party. These are all illustrations from the period that I'm talking about in the 1830s, 1840s and into the 1850s. The main cause of warfare, violence between the Namadij and the Wadawurrung, as described by, again, I'm only using the colonists, the invaders' voices, but according to Fynes, who was investigating these acts of interracial violence, as we'd call it, was predominantly due to the Aboriginal women, the Wadawurrung women, being sexually violated, and also the sheep eating the murnau. And I'll talk about that in just a second more. So violence was very much an inherent part of the frontier. So I'll go back to the previous slide just for a moment more, just to describe how prevalent. I previously described how prevalent murnong was, how it was a staple food. We know that there were Wadawurrung people reporting to the squatters. They learned English very, very quickly, I should add, reporting to the squatters within 2 years of the squatters taking up their runs in the Barat region, of saying plenty bulgana, meaning plenty cattle, plenty jumbak, meaning plenty of sheep, murnong all gone. So in a period of less than 2 years, the tens of thousands, and within a matter of 4 or 5 years, the hundreds of thousands of sheep had literally eaten out the murnong. There were reports of the sheep were literally digging the murnong root. It's a root vegetable, out with their noses, and denuding the entire environment of the Wadawurrungs and the other Kulin people's staple food. So this caused naturally enough, a fight over resources, that we have Wadawurrung people voicing to the colonisers their dismay that their food was disappearing, their normal vegetable source, their normal staple food was disappearing, and they resorted to, in times of hunger and in times as a revenge for for the taking of their foods, by attacking the whites and their sheep. Moving quickly through to the gold period, so we've traversed 30 or 40 years already, quite quickly. The gold rush period in the Wadawurrung region commenced really in 1849, a couple of years before the official gold rush, but that was only a very brief sort of interlude before the large gold rush that we know that commenced in 1851. And we see again in the illustrations and in the text of the miners and the government records and the newspapers of this period in the 1850s, that again Aboriginal people, the Wadawurrung, were very much active and had great agency in terms of the gold rush. Finding gold, we know that from newspaper reports that the Eureka lead, which was then considered one of the richest leads in the world, was discovered by a Wadawurrung person in 1852, and other very rich finds by Aboriginal people during this gold rush period. This is a illustration of Golden Point, so it gives you some idea of the Aboriginal, the Wadawurrung were obviously very present according to the goldfields artists of the time. We have other illustrations of, again, this is at the Barat diggings in 1851. You can see Wadawurrung people present, actually mining for gold, not just hangers-on or passerbys or indifferent to the gold rush. They were actively involved. Some of them, not all of them, very much along the lines of non-Aboriginal people too. Were not all non-Aboriginal people were heavily involved in the gold rush period, and so we see that same sort of blend, if you like, of sometimes passive presence, sometimes active involvement, and everything in between. In this slide, we see that that beautiful illustration of that Wadawurrung girl in her possum skin cloak. That we know during the winter periods that every Aboriginal community member in southeastern Australia, in very temperate, cold parts of Australia, wore these very large and beautiful possum skin cloaks. And one of my favourite illustrations of this time is by Eugene von Gerard, a Goldfields artist that some of you might be aware of. And this illustration is housed down at the Geelong Art Gallery, the one on the right, that is. It's called The Barter, and it illustrates a white miner bargaining, doing, sort of having a commercial transaction with Wadawurrung people. This is a illustration of Wadawurrung people trading in possum skin rugs with the white miners, which was a very lucrative trade that the Wadawurrung people initiated and maintained for 20 or 30 years during the course of the gold rush period and afterwards as well. So it's a really literally a vivid illustration of the commercial activity that was one arm of that commercial activity that Wadawurrung people were actively engaged in during the gold rush period. To give you some idea of how much the white people really wanted these manufactured goods that the Wadawurrung people made. We know from newspaper reports and miners' records themselves that they were eagerly sought after, and up to £5 was paid for a possum skin cloak, as like the one seen here on the left, worn by that Wadawurrung young woman. £5 was quite a princely sum. By comparison, probably about anywhere between $5,000 and $10,000. So very much a valued commercial commodity. One of the lesser known aspects of Aboriginal involvement in the gold mining period was as the native police. Now, the native police are usually associated, with a much more, very much a violent period of race relations in Australia, and certainly that did occur in Victoria as well. But I just want to stress that in this period, the native police were the only police that the governor had at his disposal to police the goldfields. Melbourne and Ballarat, just to give you an example of the range and the depth and breadth, I should say, of of how much the governor relied on these police. They were the two fastest growing cities in the world at that time. They literally went from a very small hamlet to a very large and vibrant cities. So we see in this illustration again of Ballarat on Wadawurrung country. We don't know whether they're Wadawurrung police. The Wadawurrung were in the Native Police Corps, escorting this prisoner who didn't have his gold licence from Ballarat to the stockade in the prison in Melbourne. The artist William Strutt illustrated this in 1851, so several years before the Eureka Stockade. One of the other really sometimes amusing and sometimes I found it surprising aspects of Wadawurrung involvement, both in the gold period but also in the squatting period as well, is their use of their cultural knowledge. So we would now call it cultural tourism. That we know that very large corroborees were held during the gold rush period, in particular at, for instance, at Lake Wendouree, what we now call Lake Wendouree. There was a very large corroboree, and at the end of the corroboree, money was expected for their performance. We also know that Wadawurrung were performing at hotels and theatres and outdoor and mechanics institutes and ovals and other public spaces across Wadawurrung country, again using their cultural capital to survive the new monetary, the new money economy that was imposed upon them. You can see just to the right, there's a small audience of white people. This is an illustration of corroborees being held in the bush during an earlier period, not during the gold rush period, when there were literally hundreds of white spectators, by way of example, at the corroboree at Lake Wendouree that I mentioned. We have an example. This illustration is probably more accurate in terms of earlier encounter by a white woman, one of the first white women in Wadawurrung country, a woman called Catherine Kirkland, described this almost this very scene of coming to being, I was going to use the word invited. She was almost forced to attend a Wadawurrung corroboree, and at the end of the corroboree, she recorded how the Wadawurrung then sort of encouraged the white people to perform a corroboree for themselves, to perform in front of the Wadawurrung. And William Yule, that we spoke about earlier, performed did did as he was asked and performed a jig and spoke some, recited some poetry. And Kirkland recorded that the Wadawurrung were very pleased with how the white people corroborated. So as emphasising these sorts of encounters, that there was a great deal of learning from one another at these events. These were not just theatrical activations. These were events to educate the white people about their culture. In a non-literate society, Aboriginal people who were the most creative, the most who could perform the best, who were the best orators, were the most important people in their communities. So these weren't just a theatrical performance. This was a political performance as well. Talking about performances and ceremonies, this is probably one of the most unusual and unique parts of my research that I encountered. This is an illustration of a ceremony by Wadawurrung people in the 1850s, so right in the heart of the gold rush period. It occurred at Buckley, and it's a religious ceremony, and the Wadawurrung described it as only invited particular white people along, or one white person in fact, a chap called William Thomas, and described it as a ceremony like Whitefellas Sunday. And I suspect that they're trying to signify that it's a very important and religious ceremony, that not a what we would call a secular or just a normal everyday ceremony that anybody could attend. And the ceremony involves what I find so fascinating about it is that those unusual humanoid sort of figures that you might be able to make out, they're looking like jigsaw pieces, if you like, are actually bark effigies that are almost 6 foot high, that were carved into bark and were placed around the ceremonial space. And the ceremony was a peace ceremony, which had elements of Christian elements in it. The master of ceremonies, for want of a better expression, read from a Bible, and the songs were all in Wadawurrung, and the dancing was a traditional dancing, but there were very distinct Christian elements spoken about in the ceremony. You can see also some flags were flown. They were created by the Wadawurrung and were flown, sort of propped up here and there around the ceremonial ground as well. So this extraordinary ceremony, using this, I describe it as a synergy of Christian and Wadawurrung religious themes running through it. So it's a very, for want of a better word, eclectic sort of type of ceremony that was being held by the Wadawurrung here on the goldfields of Victoria. So I might pause there and see if there's any questions from our audience. One of the questions coming in is, how was Buckley treated by the white community after living with them for over 32 years? Buckley's a really interesting character in that he was caught between two worlds, in his own words, and he loved the Wadawurrung. He also he was quite glad to be back, it would seem, into his own community, his own British-style community. Here's a bit of trivia for you. He was Victoria's first public servant, first locally appointed public servant. His job was effectively to mediate between the squatters and the Wadawurrung. So effectively his job was to try and avoid the frontier violence that the colonists had faced in Tasmania and in the Sydney region as well. So his job was as, we would now call him a cultural conciliator, I suppose you could say. But he didn't last long in that job. He became quite disillusioned and moved to Tasmania and lived the rest of his life there. The next question that we have coming in is, do we know what the flags were made from, and did they have any particular design? We know that we only know what William Thomas wrote, and he didn't write too much, but we can read, or just read his writing, which says the flags had a very gay appearance. They were placed very high up on a gum tree, on gum saplings. He doesn't say what they were actually made of, but presumably they were made out of cloth that the Wadawurrung had got hold of from miners. That there were 2 males and 2 females leading the dance. That those bark figures that I was telling you about were 5 foot 8 inches high. And the story was that the Wadawurrung had found some Bibles, some tobacco, and some handkerchiefs on the ground, and had sought the advice of their wise doctors, as they called them. And the doctors had said that it was a present from Weenie, which was their name for a celestial sort of spiritual body in the sky, a gift from the heavens, almost literally. And so they created this ceremony to spread peace and goodwill to all Aboriginal people across the Aboriginal nation. So they informed William Thomas that they were going to take this ceremony and share it with all the other Aboriginal people across Victoria. Was their what they meant to do. Another question says, Lake Wendouree corroboree, ? Doesn't Wendouree mean go away? So it seems strange that they would be welcoming the white people with a corroboree. Maybe most of you are familiar with how Lake Wendouree got its name, which was by William Ewell again, described how he rode up to a Wadawurrung woman who was sitting beside what was then the Wendouree swamp, or the swamp. We're not sure what the Wadawurrung actual name for that site was, and asked, what do you call this place? And she replied quite tersely with the word Wendouree. Ewell didn't realise until later, when he learnt some of the Wadawurrung language, that Wendouree actually means be away with you. But Wendouree, the site of the Wendouree swamp as it was then, was a site of ceremonial importance and a site of great food, almost like a supermarket, if you like. The Ballarat landscape was said to, including Lake Wendouree, was said to be a very rich food resource for the Wadawurrung. Another question says, can you give a bit of insight into the government native protectors? The person asking the question says that they recently read about one of the protectors called Charles Sivrite, that he was removed by the establishment. There was what was called the protectorate system was in place. It was established in 1838, so it's just a few years after the official invasion commenced. There were 4 protectors. The chief protector was called George Augustus Robinson, and there was Charles Sivrite, whose territory was the Wadawurrung territory. He was meant to protect the Aboriginal people from violence from the white colonisers, and protect the white colonisers from violence by the Wadawurrung people. There was Parker, was the gentleman's name, who was another protector in just to the north of Wadawurrung country, near Dalesford area, and William Thomas in the Western Port area. Sivrite was removed. There was a large scandal about his activities, or lack of activity, so the governor removed him from his job. Another question coming in, is there any record that colonisers recognised the different Aboriginal groups? there was a lot of fast learning going on by the colonisers when they arrived. Many of them were dubbed the Glasgow Invasion, because most of them were young Scottish men and their wife and young Scottish women, and most of them had very little knowledge about how to survive in the bush, and they quickly became reliant on the Wadawurrung to literally survive particularly in the first 5 to 10 years, until they learnt what we would now call Aboriginal biocultural knowledge from the Wadawurrung, which enabled them to live in the bush comfortably. So they quickly came to realise that that different areas, that Aboriginal people belonged to different areas. That initially they thought that all Aboriginal people spoke the same language and all Aboriginal people were the same, but very quickly they realised that was just not true. That Aboriginal people were very much attached to their very specific locality, as we saw in that map that reconstructed language map that we saw at the start of the slide. Another question asks, where did the image of the shield and weapons on the earlier slide come from? Again, that was from Eugene von Gerard, the goldfields artist who stayed in Ballarat for some time. He was a failed gold miner, like many gold miners actually failed and went back to their original trades, and von Gerard did the same. He didn't find much gold, so he started painting illustrations. He did many illustrations of Aboriginal people, including Wadawurrung people, and which people in Europe were quite hungry for, were quite eager to get hold of. So yes, that illustration comes from von Gerard, and they would be Wadawurrung weapons that he drew. Another question says, why was William Thomas at Buninyong? He's usually associated more with the Melbourne base, which is true. William Thomas, when the protectorate that we spoke about earlier was disbanded in 1850, so it only lasted a little over a decade, from 1838, 1839 to 1850. And with the advent of the gold rush, just before the gold rush, the protectorate ended, and William Thomas was the only one who was kept on by the government. He became what was then known as the guardian of Aboriginal people in Victoria. And so he would go to he would travel around other parts of Victoria besides just the area surrounding Melbourne. We know that he was fluent in Wadawurrung. He produced a little booklet, in fact, about the Wadawurrung language, and he was invited by the Wadawurrung because he was seen as, he was described as Marana Mata, which means father in the Kulin Wadawurrung language. Another question coming in. Did any Aboriginal people actually work on the sealing boats? Yes, they did. Most of them probably, well, not probably, most of them were forced to work by what we would now call a form of slavery, of servitude on sealing boats. We do have some records of Aboriginal people voluntarily, willingly becoming whalers. A historian from Monash University, Lynette Russell, has written an Aboriginal scholar, has written quite a really interesting account of Aboriginal whalers and sealers. Many of them, like I mentioned, were forced into working with them. But yeah, there were some who didn't. Another question that's come in, did Scottish radicals who struggled against oppression in their own country apply their liberation politics to Aboriginal people? It's a really good question, because we know that both the Scottish and the Irish had been literally ousted from their lands on many occasions, and then came to Australia and ousted Aboriginal people from their land. So at a glance, you might imagine, or I imagined at least, that they might have some sense of empathy with Aboriginal people being ousted from their lands. We don't really have much evidence of that occurring. We have some Scottish people, such as a fellow called William Bale in the Learmonth area on Wadawurrung country, who spoke Wadawurrung fluently and allowed the Wadawurrung what was called free egress, which meant records clearly indicate that Wadawurrung people were welcome into his hut and worked and lived alongside squatters such as William Bale. He was an anomaly. The usual practice was Thomas Learmonth and his brothers, who took the land, 100,000 acres in the Learmonth region and Buninyong region. We know that their shepherds had Wadawurrung skulls at the front of their huts. So definitely not weren't applying any liberation politics to the Wadawurrung in some instances, and in other instances we see some evidence of it. Another question, any records of them struggling with cognitive dissonance of being a colonizer? I probably see more, I think I could confidently say I see more of that empathy from the miners, who were more of a middle-class, educated mindset, rather than the squatters, who had very much sheep was their only reason for being here. So we see a lot of empathy coming through, particularly in the newspapers of the gold mining period, about Aboriginal rights should be upheld. By way of example, we have records of when discussion about the Eureka flag was being discussed by the miners here in Ballarat. One miner wrote in his journal in December 1854 that the Aboriginal flag, we don't know what Aboriginal flag he was referring to, but the natives flag, as he described it, which is what many whites called Aboriginal people in that period, should be represented in the Eureka flag. They hadn't quite got round to designing a Eureka flag at that point in time. Should be represented because they were on the goldfields as well. So we see some notion by select number of individuals empathetic and sympathetic to the Aboriginal sort of rights that were being denied them very clearly. One of the questions coming in is, you said that this is from the perspective of the coloniser, the book that is. Do we have many surviving primary sources from the Aboriginal perspective? Not many. There's some very, almost call them delicious sort of moments where, by way of example, of an Aboriginal person writing a letter to the governor during the Gold Rush period, just after the Eureka Rebellion, saying that he was the owner of all this land, and that his rights should be acknowledged and he should be given some recompense. So we have snippets, real very slender sort of snippets of Aboriginal people voicing their resistance to the whites, and their voices of disdain of the intrusion and the invasion by the whites. Another question, would you ever consider writing about the more recent history of Wadawurrung peoples and our survival living in two worlds? I'm taking a big pregnant pause, because one of the reasons why I chose to write it from the invaders' perspective was that I consulted with the Wadawurrung community some 20 years ago, and more recently too, of course, when I commenced this research, and they expressed that they were okay with me writing a whitefellas version of this history. Some elders, that is, not all Aboriginal representatives in the Wadawurrung community, but they were quite insistent, which was easy to comply with, that they would write their own history. So no, I don't really have any intention of writing a more contemporary sort of version, sort of up to date, up to current day sort of version. That's for Wadawurrung people to do for themselves. So we're going to finish up there. If you say, if people want to quickly get in another question, you better do so very quickly. So we're going to be here just for another minute or so. So thank you very much for having me in your lounge rooms. Cheers for now.